So I'd like to now start talking about how you would actually conduct an AI assurance engagement. And before I start getting into the definitions of the different types of engagement, attestation versus direct, the difference between like underlying subject matter versus subject matter information, I want to kind of walk through a real example of a type of system and a type of reporting that you might provide assurance over. So here's an example from Anthropic. This is quite recent. Developing nuclear safeguards for AI through public-private partnership. So here, Anthropic partnered with the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, to assess models for nuclear proliferation risks and continue to work with them on different evaluations. So what they were basically trying to do is co-develop a classifier. So another AI system that's going to automatically categorize content. And what they're trying to distinguish between is sort of what they call harmful later or concerning content or queries versus benign nuclear related conversations. So that's what they worked on. And so what did they actually build? How did they build it? So let's take a look here at a description of their process. And so essentially what they did is they identified risks. This was from the NNSA. They essentially went through a red teaming exercise, toying with the models, really trying to identify and classify for themselves what are risky queries versus not so risky queries. And that, again, the outputs of that are going to be transferred over to Anthropic. So they're going to share these risk indicators. And then Anthropic is going to sort of develop a classifier. And so in this case, the classifier is going to be another AI model, presumably based on some version of Claude, where you're going to have as an input the query. I'll put little quotes here. And the output is going to be something like, this is benign, we're going to let it go through, or wait a second, this is harmful, in the context of nuclear and radiological risks. They're going to then sort of give the results. They're going to test this classifier. They're going to give results over to the NNSA, who are going to sort of validate whether Anthropic got it right. And then based on that, Anthropic is going to presumably build a bigger data set and sort of evaluate the performance here. Okay? And so one thing that was apparent is that one of the problems is protection of IP. So they said one of the biggest challenges here is balancing national security versus, a private AI company's interest in intellectual property and their combined interest in safety. And so what they did is they actually started using synthetic data. So synthetic data was used to get some examples based on the example prompts from the NNSA. And they got hundreds of test cases to create a robust evaluation set. Okay, so here's where they sort of start presenting the results of their test. So this is a classic case of the kind of situation where you might want to have an assurance engagement. So this is a company, this is Anthropic, and I'll draw sort of Anthropic here. These are the developers. They have an AI system which is sort of risk relevant. They have tested it. They're presenting numerical performance results. And there are a variety of stakeholders who might be interested in the veracity of this information. And an example could be regulators in the European Union, where they have general purpose AI regulations, which have passed as part of the EU AI Act. They might be interested in these results. There are laws that are getting passed in California and New York related to these foundational models and AI safety, safety systems that they might have in place. So you could imagine, the attorney generals of those states, if they were doing an investigation, might want to look into how accurate are these results. And so this is a perfect example where you would call on potentially a third-party independent assurance provider. Like many of you watching are either our auditors or our partners or aspiring assurance professionals, AI assurance professionals. So this could be you. So there are a number of different ways you can do that. So let's assume for a second that this is the auditor is not going to be doing the testing. So the auditor is not going to test. So this is going to be an attestation result engagement. So what that means is these test results have been conducted by the Anthropic team And all the assurance professional is doing is providing either reasonable or limited, maybe it's agreed upon procedures, but some level, kind of a level of assurance that those are accurate. So it's adding credibility to that information. So what does the information actually look like? Well, let's imagine for a second, I'm going to draw this as if it's a document. The testing results will look something like this. There's going to be a prompt, which is one of these queries. So the prompt is going to be here. Then there's going to be the ground truth. So I'm going to label this as a Y. So this is going to be like, let's say this is benign. So that's a check mark. And then there's going to be the output of their classifier. Remember, the classifier is this little model that has an input and it outputs either like a check mark for it's benign or like an X or something. I'm making this up. I don't actually know what the output looks like. It could be yes, no, 1, 0, something like that. But I'll label this as sort of Y tilde or Y hat. Okay, and let's say you got it right. So that's this. And there will be other queries where it might be harmful and they've labeled it correctly as harmful. But based on this is a confusion matrix. There will be some cases where it's actually harmful. So this is the true label, but it was labeled as benign. That's 5.2% of the cases. So this are the false negative rate. So these are ones that were actually harmful. So this is the ground truth, but they were labeled as benign. There's going to be a few of those in here, but the majority of them are going to be either benign and they label them correctly as benign, but there might be a few that are labeled incorrectly as benign, even though they were harmful. And there's going to be many of them that were harmful and they caught it. Those are these cases. Okay, so there could be a lot of these. We don't know how many. They didn't really say in hard numbers here. But these are the results. This is where they got. They had to run this test in order to. And so what we're going to do is verify that. Now, in an ideal world where things were totally open, we would get access as auditors to those test results. And we would get access to the model in some way, probably through some kind of, secure API, right? Get access to the model. So if this were the case, probably they wouldn't need an assurance engagement. But if this were the case, things would be very simple. We would simply take these results. We would take these prompts. We would run it through the classifier and we would compare what we get with what they are reporting. Now, of course, there might be some level of sort of randomness or stochasticity to this model. And so we have to allow for some sort of materiality. And materiality just threshold is going to be something, normally it's reported in percent. So we could say maybe we expect a deviation that's no more than like 5% or maybe 3%, something like that. And, this threshold that we're willing to allow deviations from are going to be informed. Right now, I just made these numbers up. They would be informed by lots of different factors, such as, how big is this data set? How much intrinsic stochasticity did Anthropic report? And how much do we actually expect? Those sorts of things. And what's the understanding of the intended user of the report? And that's a big important framing to have as an assurance professional here, an AI assurance professional. What's the intended what the intended user thinking, or what are they supposed to get from this report, like a reasonable person? So, okay, let's pretend for a second that this is not the case, because typically this is not the case. So we don't really get a full access to this. And so if we don't get full access to the testing data, but let's say we do get access to the model through API, then we can do a number of different things. One, and the most reasonable one here, is to sample. And so what we might say is, okay, Anthropic, why don't you give us, maybe there's like a capital N number of these tests. Maybe you just give us a lowercase n, which is where n is sort of much less than capital N here. N number of these tests, and then you send those to us. And we want you to show us the code that you use to randomly sample, because you have to be careful. You don't want them, selectively pulling these out and sending us a selection. So typically we're going to actually want to look at how they sampled it and verify that. Okay, so we're pretty confident they randomly sampled these and they send us little n. And now what we can do, if they give us access to the actual system, now what we're doing is we're doing the same thing we did before, but with a smaller number. And we are looking to confirm that the label that they say it was matches up with the label that we get when we run it through the classifier. And again, we have similar materiality constraints that we've set ahead of time. This time, knowing that we're getting a smaller subset and factoring in the same kinds of information, we're going to sample this to verify. So if we start seeing deviations that are beyond this, then we consider those material, and we're going to have a sort of adverse opinion here. Now, there are cases where, and in addition, we might want to check controls, and there's other things that we can check too. Another thing that we would do here, well, actually, I should go into this. Another thing that we do, we don't just check verify this subsample. We can also do other things. The other thing is to check the content. Now, the intended user of this report, the person, the regulator, the attorney general, the customer, a developer who's going to use this in their system, they are going to have some preconceived notions about what these tests are actually doing. So, for instance, I think the assumption here is that all of these prompts are things that are related to nuclear or radiological something, and that some of them are benign and some of them are harmful. And if we start seeing things that are just related to, like, is the grass green or is the sky blue, totally unrelated, then that would be worrisome. That's not what I think the average person who's reading these numbers is thinking. They're thinking all of these are related to nuclear or radiological or weapons or something, but some are benign and some are not. And so that would be something that deviates from what the intended user thinks, and either they have to correct that or sort of disclose that in the report, or it's going to be sort of, that's a material difference. Now that's checking the content, right? We can also start to, instead of just verifying this subsample n, if n is big enough, so let's say n is smaller than little n, but not much smaller, and depending on the size, we might be able to actually start checking these numbers. So we're sampling from a distribution where the total distribution is going to have these numbers, but if we get enough of them, we might be able to estimate whether these numbers are in the ballpark of being correct. Now, that is going to be difficult, probably, given the number that we would be able to get. But if n is big enough, you can start to do it. And we would understand what the error bars are on this, and so we could sort of see if it's going to deviate beyond what we would expect, given the error bars. Speaking of error bars, there are no error bars here, and they're showing a precision down to the tenth of a percent. And so we would start to look at the standard deviation of this and start to ask questions about the robustness. If you were to calculate this several times, what's the standard deviation? Because the intended user is probably thinking that this is roughly, that the variations probably exist down on the 100th decimal place here, or the 100th of a percent. And if they're actually, standard deviation is showing variations like up to here or up to here, then this is misleading. And so this is another case where we want to check and think about what the intended user wants. There are some cases where we might not even get access to the API. And in this case, there are other things that we can do. One might be that we fly to the offices, or we get on some sort of Zoom call or something. And what we could do is, if we can't get access to the API, we might want to, I'll put a little eyeball here, we might want to sort of observe them performing these tests. Okay, so one thing is to come and just look over their shoulder. So we're not sort of recording their IP, we're not getting access, because you can imagine if they give us direct API access, there's a chance that we could try to, or we wouldn't try this, but somebody, an auditor, would try to get the system prompt without their permission, right? And so there's good reason why they may not want to give us API access either. And so another possibility is to actually observe the reperformance of these and to see that these tests are repeatable, that we get the same answers, they get the same answers, we can see it, we can test to make sure that it's the right model, the model that they're testing corresponds to the model they say they got these numbers from. And of course, the materiality concerns would also hold up. We'd want to look for deviations beyond what we sort of determined as the threshold. Okay. So this is just an example of the kind of engagement that we do as AI assurance professionals. And it's great because it has a mix of, a risk relevant or a sort of regulatory relevant output, and it has the actual performance numbers. It has a description of how it was developed and assessed, and it has this sort of notion that these company Anthropic doesn't want to necessarily allow any old auditor or anybody have access to the intellectual property, and so it brings in some of these complications and this necessity for sample-based testing, which is sort of at the core of actually performing these kind of engagements. And so what I want to talk about next is going to be what are the conditions for actually performing an engagement like this. Get into some of the definitions between, difference between direct versus attestation, subject matter versus subject matter information, and those sorts of things.